They were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first. I felt strongly about that. And
now, when we think of the Middle East, conflict often comes to mind. But what if it wasn't just another flare-up? What if it was the explosive finale to a story that's been building for 80 years? That's what we're going to dig into. We're going to trace this hypothetical but scarily plausible path to a war in 2026 and see just how deep these historical cracks really run. So picture this. It's February 2026, early morning, but the sky over Iran isn't lighting up with the sunrise. No, it's lighting up with fire from incoming airstrikes. A conflict that's been simmering for decades has just hit its boiling point, and it is catastrophic. And the opening shots, they are just staggering. You've got US and Israeli jets hitting targets in 9 different Iranian cities. And then the unthinkable. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, the guy who's been in power for over 30 years, basically the face of the Islamic Republic, he's killed. Iran's response? It is swift and it is massive. We're talking hundreds of drones and missiles screaming towards places like Dubai, hitting US military bases all over the Gulf, and you can bet the world is watching, completely horrified as oil prices just go through the roof. But look, this didn't just happen out of the blue. This wasn't some sudden attack. It was more like the final violent scene in a play that's been going on for 80 years. So that's the big question, right? How in the world did we get here? How did all those decades of secret fights and broken promises finally explode into open war? All right, to figure this out, we've got to rewind. We're going to start with a betrayal that basically poisoned the well right from the start. Then we'll look at the revolution that set the whole region on fire. After that, we dive into this long, murky shadow war. And finally, we'll look at the one deal that might, just might, have stopped all of this from happening. Okay, so our story really kicks off back in 1953. This is the event that for a lot of Iranians is the original sin in their relationship with the West. This is where the first seeds of deep, lasting mistrust were planted. Seeds that would, eventually grow into the war we're talking about. So what was the big deal in 1953? Well, it boils down to this. On one side, you've got Iran's first real democratic leader, a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh. He does something incredibly popular. He says, hey, Iran's oil should belong to Iran. And he nationalizes this massive British oil company. On the other side, you've got Great Britain, whose entire empire basically ran on that oil. So what do? They start plotting to get rid of him. And this plot, it had a cool spy movie name, Operation Ajax. It was a team-up, the CIA and Britain's MI6, and their goal was simple. Get Mossadegh out, put the young, easy-to-control Shah back in absolute power, and get that oil flowing back to the West. I mean, it was classic covert ops, propaganda, paying people to riot in the streets, the whole shebang. But the thing is, the fallout from this was just catastrophic in the long run. As historian Stephen Kinzer points out, yeah, the coup worked at first, but for the United States, it was a total disaster down the road. Why? Because it crushed Iran's democracy and put the Shah in power. And the Shah's brutal rule is what directly led to the 1979 revolution that America would spend decades worrying about. So that anger from 1953, it didn't just go away. It was like a pressure cooker, just simmering for decades under the Shah's thumb. And then in 1979, it just exploded. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some local event. This revolution completely redrew the map of the Middle East. And it all happened so fast. You had these massive protests in 78. People were just fed up with the Shah and his brutal secret police, the Savak. The whole country just ground to a halt. By January of 79, the Shah was on a plane, heading for a so-called vacation he'd never come back from. And then boom, just 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini lands in Tehran, and that's it. A 2,500-year-old monarchy, gone. Just like that. And then there's this number, 444. This isn't just a number. It's a scar. It stands for the 444 days that 52 Americans were held hostage inside their own embassy in Tehran. That one event, it just shattered everything. Diplomatic ties were cut, and it poisoned the relationship between the US and Iran for literally generations. Okay, so after the revolution and that whole hostage crisis, a direct head-to-head war wasn't really an option for anyone. So Iran got smart. It came up with a new way to fight its enemies, the US and Israel, without actually fighting them directly. And that's when we enter the long, dark era of the Shadow War. And this right here is Iran's playbook. They call it the axis of resistance. It's a really clever and, yeah, often destructive strategy. Basically, Iran funds, trains, and arms all these other groups across the Middle East. You know, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen. These groups, these proxies, can then go after American and Israeli targets, and Iran can kind of say, hey, wasn't us. It's a way to surround your enemies and fight them without ever having to declare an actual war. And what this did was create this crazy, vicious cycle that just went on and on for decades. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Iran works on its nuclear program, seeing it as like the ultimate survival guarantee. Step 2. The US and Israel try to stop them, but quietly. They use cyber attacks like the famous Stuxnet virus, or they assassinate Iranian scientists. Then, step 3, Iran retaliates, but through its proxies. They'll have Hezbollah or someone else strike back. And of course, that just gives the US and Israel more reason to launch another covert attack. Round and round we go. This just became normal. But then, in the middle of all this chaos, there was a breakthrough. A real glimmer of hope. A chance to finally break that cycle. It was the biggest diplomatic push ever to solve this thing. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal, or as the policy folks call it, the JCPOA. And the deal itself was actually pretty straightforward. Here's the treat. Iran promised to dramatically roll back its nuclear program and let international inspectors come in and check everything. In exchange, the world's biggest powers, that's the US, UK, France, China, Russia, plus Germany, they promised to lift all the crushing economic sanctions that had been strangling Iran's economy. So it was basically a deal. You give us nuclear limits, we give you economic relief. And you know what? For 3 years, it was actually working. The international inspectors kept saying, yep, Iran is holding up its end of the bargain. Everything was on track. But then, May 8th, 2018, a new administration in the US had a very different opinion. And just like that, they pulled out of the deal. Unilaterally. They just walked away. All those sanctions came crashing back down, and that one single diplomatic exit ramp that everyone had worked so hard to build, it was just gone. What happened after that was a fast and, frankly, terrifying spiral downwards. I mean, look at how quickly it all unraveled. First, the US takes out Iran's most powerful general, Qasem Soleimani, in a drone strike. Then, an Iran-backed Hamas launches a massive attack on Israel, which kicks off a huge regional war. Israel hits back hard, assassinating the leaders of both Hamas and Hezbollah. Then, for the first time in history, Iran itself launches direct military strikes on Israel. By the middle of 2025, the Shadow War is totally over. It's out in the open, with the US and Israel conducting major strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And that brings us right back to where we began this story, February 2026, with bombs falling on Tehran. We followed the breadcrumbs all the way from that coup in 1953 to the broken deal in 2018. So, after all that, what's the verdict? How do we make sense of this 80-year road to war? I think this is the question we really have to wrestle with, right? When you look at this long, tangled chain of events, was this war just inevitable? Was it always going to end this way? Or could things have gone differently? You know, when you really look at the history, it seems like the answer is no, it wasn't inevitable. It was a product of choices. Think about these what-if moments, these off-ramps that were just missed. What if in 1953, the US had supported Iran's young democracy instead of overthrowing it? What if in the 80s, instead of playing both sides in the Iran-Iraq war, the US had pushed for peace? And what if, in 2018, the US had just stayed in the nuclear deal that everyone agreed was working? Any one of those choices could have changed everything. So here we are, the war we started with. It feels like the logical, terrible conclusion to decades of anger, mistrust, and so many missed chances. And now, with Iran's supreme leader dead and the whole region engulfed in flames, there's really only one question that matters. What in the world happens now?